Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast, where we discuss the philosophy and skills of lightweight backcountry travel so you can experience the outdoors with more comfort, safety, and enjoyment. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan, and today's podcast is a skills short about training for backpacking trips.
So, Ryan, this topic sprung from a series of blog posts you've been writing on the website and a series of conversations I've been having with some of my family members. So, the way we've structured it is just to ask a series of questions, sort of FAQ style, and then we'll kind of go from there. Sound good?
That sounds great.
This is a very common question. Living at sea level. What do you do if you are living at sea level, but you're training for a hike at, say, around 6,000 feet or above?
That's a great question. So let's preface that by talking about what we mean by training. And so when I think of training, I'm thinking of an intentional activity during the course of your normal week where you are developing physical fitness for some future objective. And that might be your backpacking vacation in the summer, or maybe you're just trying to stay fit to go backpacking on the weekends, or maybe you have some long expedition that you have planned. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Now, at sea level, you're a little bit limited in the tools you have, but not necessarily in your ability to allow your body to adapt to the mountains. So some of the basic options that I like to offer, the biggest one is if you live in a city that has some tall buildings, some skyscrapers, and you have access to the stairwells in those skyscrapers, then that is a terrific way to build physical fitness in and work your legs. So, I live close to Denver, and I know that a few of my friends who live in the Denver metro area who don't necessarily have immediate access several days a week to go to the mountains in the Front Range and hike or climb or whatever, they hustle up and down these skyscrapers. And one friend in particular will climb the stairwell of what's essentially a public building. I think there's 28 floors in it. And then he'll ride the elevators down and then take the stairs back up and ride the elevators down. So, and then he'll do that with a backpack to simulate a weight load, obviously. And that's a terrific activity. Now, the disadvantage if you are operating at sea level and doing this is that you're not adapting your red blood cells to altitude like you would be if you were training in Denver, for example. But still, the fitness probably is far more important. The physical activity of climbing like that is far more important than finding a high altitude area so that you can adapt red blood cells. Now, if you live in a rural area or a small city and you don't have access to tall buildings, then I really think you're kind of stuck to the last option, which is a stair climber or a treadmill at the gym. And it is as boring as it can be. But when it's your only option, having the level of discipline to work out, especially on a stair machine, can go a long ways to making your backpacking trips more enjoyable.
So you mentioned the treadmill, and that actually kind of goes into my next question, which is about strengthening the muscles, actually, those small muscles in your feet and ankles and your calves to deal with uneven terrain. So I guess another way to look at this is training under load on an inclined treadmill an effective use of your time, assuming you don't have any kind of uneven ground you can get to within easy reach, or is there something different you could be doing?
There's some conflict in the application of training methods for stable training versus unstable training. I am an advocate of stable training. I don't think you need access to unstable ground to develop ankle strength. I do think you need to put as many miles on your feet as possible over a long period of time, and that ultimately will allow your ligaments and tendons to adapt to the load in your ankle and knee and things like that. So for me, I recommend staying on stable ground for your training, especially if you're carrying a pack, because it allows you to move faster and operate at a little bit higher heart rate than you would be able to do if you were on unstable ground. And the ability to build your aerobic base by doing that is far more valuable than trying to develop the muscle memory to deal with unstable ground. There's a lot of other stability exercises you can do to help your brain create stability in your lower leg. One of my favorites is a box step. So you got a box that's usually between 12 inches and 18 inches tall. And maybe you're doing this unweighted. You should always start these exercises unweighted. Maybe you're doing it with a pack as you progress. And you step up onto the box with one leg and you hold that there until your leg stops wobbling. And that point at which your leg stops wobbling has as much to do with your brain stabilizing your muscles as it does with the strength of the muscles in your leg. So to me, exercises like that are on a stable platform are far more valuable.
Are all miles created equal? So, in other words, is something like street running or even cycling helpful or sufficient for backpacking training?
The risk of street running is overuse, and a lot of people who take to the pavement for fitness, they're living on borrowed time because you are repeating the same exact motion over and over and over, especially if there's no elevation involved. So I tend to be more of a fan of trail running and fast hiking for fitness because it does provide just a little bit of change in every step so that you're not overusing one set of muscles. So now, in terms of cycling or treadmill walking or trail walking, are they all created equal? I don't think they are. I think cycling is a really fantastic way to train, to keep your aerobic fitness up and to maintain leg strength in your, especially in your quads. But what it doesn't do, it's cycling is so efficient
Mm,
I mean, you're using this really efficient machine, and so really it's mostly your legs engaged in the whole process. But as you know, with a backpack on in the mountains, we're using way more than our legs. We're using our core and our ankles and the entire chain in between. And I think we have to train mimicking that activity as much as possible and stressing the core chain all the way down to the feet as much as possible so that we can be adapting our bodies to the backpacking activity. So in that respect, the absolute best way to get the most adaptation in the least amount of time, it's always going to be trail running. But that's not feasible for some people. Some people don't like to run or they aren't runners. And so the second best thing I would recommend is hiking fast with a light pack so that you can A, keep your heart rate up, and B, provide a lot of stress on your body in as little amount of time as possible because we're all on a time budget and we just don't have the ability to go backpacking every day in order to train for backpacking, right?
absolutely. So, follow up question: when you say hiking fast, I assume that there's a target heart rate we're looking for there, rather than say an actual speed, because that's going to be different for everybody, right?
Absolutely. And I think the to understand how this works, there's two really important heart rate targets that you want to be aware of. One is the aerobic threshold, and this is a pretty easy heart rate to determine on your own. Yeah, I like doing it at the gym because it is a controlled environment. And so what I will do is, get on a treadmill and start hiking on zero incline for, 3 or 3.5 miles an hour, monitoring my heart rate as I go. And then every 2 minutes, I will bump up the incline of the treadmill 5 degrees. And then 2 minutes later, 5 more degrees. 2 minutes later, 5 more degrees until I'm able to I guess where the threshold occurs when you have to start breathing through your mouth. You do this test with your mouth closed, and then the moment you start opening your mouth because you need more oxygen, the heart rate that occurs at that moment, that's generally within 5 beats or so of your aerobic threshold. And it's a great indicator. So when I'm training to build an aerobic base, I'm going to spend the vast majority of my time at or below that threshold. So somewhere in the range of 80 to 100% of that value. The The other heart rate that's worth mentioning, and this is the one that most people are familiar with, is the anaerobic threshold. And this is basically the heart rate that occurs when you do an all-out effort for about an hour. So the best way to determine this is, wear a heart rate monitor, and I use a like a Garmin watch or something like that, because then it tracks it throughout your workout. But run or exercise or do something at a pace that you can sustain for an hour, so that by the end of the hour you're pretty tired. I mean, you're going all out as much as you can for an hour, and that average heart rate that usually comes out of that is very close to your anaerobic threshold. So I spend very little time between my aerobic and anaerobic threshold. Now, later on in my training, I'm going to do some muscular endurance activities like hill sprints. And when I do those, I'm definitely going to dance up near my anaerobic threshold. That's your interval style of workout. But for most people, when they're training and they don't have a strong aerobic base, it's almost irrelevant.
So remind me to circle back around at the end of this podcast to what your general training plan is in terms of a timeline, days a week, things like that.
Yeah, you bet.
So what about, you mentioned earlier stabilizing muscles in the back and core, the posterior chain. Is there any reason to incorporate upper body resistance training into your training regimen, as maybe especially in those areas?
When the general population sees a hiker on the trail who has a ripped upper body, they think they're awesome. So there's a social benefit, right? Especially maybe if you're like mating or something like that. I don't spend a lot of time on upper body, and I'll say that with an asterisk. There's two situations I do. I do pull exercises like pull ups, and I have a bar and a cage in my house. So I have a couple ice axes rigged from the pull up bar on that cage, and I'll do ice axe pull ups in a nearly horizontal position. And so that's my main pull exercise. And then my main push exercise is bench press or push ups. And so I do those. I don't do much beyond those. And the reason is I would like a little bit of upper body strength so that I can effectively use trekking poles and not have my arms get fatigued. So that's my primary motivation when it comes to backpacking. Obviously, I would like the strength to be able to lift a heavy pack, and so being able to have a strong back and a strong lats and things like that help certainly doing that. The other situation is if I'm training for climbing, where I'm using an ice axe or a pair of ice tools overhead. And then I will do a far more intentional upper body workout that is probably beyond the scope of what most backpackers need or want.
How about flexibility? How important is flexibility in muscles and connective tissue?
I think it's very important. The limitation to being super flexible is that you may suffer some injury because of your flexibility. So, one area where I would be very cautious about flexibility is in your ankles, for example. There's a lot of um, exercises you can do to stretch your ankles that actually elongate your tendons and ligaments. I would do this under the supervision of a wise personal trainer who's aware of this effect so that you don't overdo it. Otherwise, you'll end up having ankles that will not be able to catch themselves as you roll your foot. So, that is the one area where I'm very, very careful about flexibility. The area where I'm a huge fan of flexibility is in your posterior chain in general. If you're able to do, for example, a full squat where you can squat down to the floor and bring your butt between your feet and nearly touch your butt to the floor, that's a good thing to work towards. Now, as you age, you become more inflexible and this becomes more difficult, but that, for example, is an area where you could work towards better flexibility. And the way to do that is through very slow and easy stretching. Some yoga poses are really good for this, and it takes a really long time. Don't expect to shatter any of your personal flexibility records, on a weekly basis.
Mm. Yeah, and chances are, most people are not going to be so flexible as to worry about injury on a trip,
Right,
right?
right.
Usually, the problem is going to go in the other direction, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So let's talk just briefly about nutrition. Now, we touch on this a lot in our nutrition podcast, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But just wondering if you had any thoughts specifically on pre trip nutrition, since we're talking about training in this podcast.
It depends on how far in advance pre-trip we're talking about. Are you talking about the night before, or are we talking about, my normal day-to-day eating habits?
Let's say somewhere in between. So let's say you have a trip coming up in 6 weeks and you start training on day one of your 6 week training program before you leave for your trip. Do your eating habits change at all, or are you just keeping on with what you normally do?
Yeah, I they don't change much, but if I'm in a long training cycle, something that's in the region of 6 to 8 months or 9 months, as I get late into the more advanced stages of that training cycle, maybe in month 6, 7, 8, I'm doing more muscular endurance and interval work to kind of fine tune. And we can talk about this a little bit later. But as you do that, your carbohydrate needs go up substantially. And so I tend to need to shift my diet to not only increase my calories, but to increase my carbo loading so that I can maintain good glycogen stores because they get pretty depleted in those workouts. But that's really the only thing I do differently than my normal day-to-day diet. Other than that, I tend to follow, right now at least, I'm following an intermittent fasting routine where I fast one day and I eat fairly normally the other day. And so generally, I'm doing weight training on my days that I'm fasting, and I'm doing hard or longer aerobic activities on days where I'm eating normally because I'm eating more calories and I have the energy to fuel the training that might take, 2 or 3 hours on those days.
And it probably goes without saying, but a good diet, just in general, and diet with a lowercase d, not diet as in like a fad diet, but just what you're eating on a daily basis, the more good whole food, vegetables, things like that you're putting in your body, the better off you're going to be on a long hike when your nutrition is probably not as complete.
I totally agree. And the longer the hike and the more difficult it is, and by more difficult, I mean the longer you are hiking per day, not necessarily mileage, but the more activity you're having on a day to day basis. I mean, if you put in 12-hour days for, even 2 weeks or more, your body is going to become nutritionally unbalanced. And the ability to go into a trip like that running on all cylinders nutritionally is going to be really important.
Yeah. Well, let's talk injuries for a second. One of the most common backpacking injuries is a stress fracture. So, can you take a second and define that? And is there any way to train to avoid getting one?
I wish there was a formula to do so. I don't think there is. I've incurred a number of stress fractures. I had a stress fracture in one metatarsal this spring and what looked like possible stress fractures in two other ones. But the cause of those this year was a result of some arthritis in my MTP joint in my toe, causing me to change my gait and transfer more load to those metatarsals. So that was a fairly complicated scenario. A more common scenario is repetitive overuse injuries. And so you're talking about stress fracture in your bone. And when that happens, what you've done, it's not an acute injury. This is something that is chronic and has occurred over, thousands of steps, most likely. The cause of that is you probably did not have either functioning joints in your foot, which is a nearly impossible thing to be aware of before you've been made aware of it. And the second issue is your feet and perhaps your legs have not been adapted to doing, I'm going to call it long miles, but it's longer miles than what you're used to. So it really, working up to long distances and long days and faster speeds, it should be a really slow, careful, methodical process. And so if you're patient, you'll minimize the risk of stress fractures. But if you're impatient, far more likely to incur a stress fracture from overuse. And my every stress fracture I've had in my history, whether it's been in my feet or other parts of my body, it's been primarily because I've been impatient. I wanted to do too much too fast, or I didn't. Another thing people take for granted is they don't recover enough from the training they're doing, and that's really important. There's an old adage that says there's no such thing as overtraining, just under recovery, and I can't emphasize that enough. And you learn how to recover and how much recovery time you need the more you do this. And starting out under the auspices of a coach or personal trainer is not a bad idea, because they will throttle you back, because these guys have been taught that.
How about other parts of your feet? So one of the things that I'm particularly prone to blisters. Even when my system is firing on all cylinders and I've got the right shoes and the right toe box and the right socks and I'm using all sorts of lubricants and lotions and potions on my feet. I mean, I get it all dialed in. I'm still going to get a blister every time. So I'm wondering, is there any way to toughen up the skin of your feet pre-hike to try to head that off a little bit even more?
Sure, soak them in rubbing alcohol and let them dry several times a day. I think it's a terrible idea, but that will definitely toughen up the skin on your feet. I don't think it will help you on the trail. I used to do all sorts of crazy things when I was younger, 15, 20, 25 years ago, exactly to do that. And the main thing I did was, I used to live in Eastern Washington, and would go climbing down on the Snake River, and there's lots of like sharp rock and hot sand and all this kind of stuff. So I used to go around barefoot when I wasn't on the rock, and my skin got tougher. The thing that I wasn't prepared for when I went backpacking was that, because the tough skin was not malleable, it
Mhm.
ended up cracking. And that causes a whole new set of far more painful problems than small
Mhm.
blisters. So,
Mhm.
so now I've kind of evolved into a an opposite strategy, and I actually prefer taking care of my feet so that they're not so tough. And you do that with, some really viscous foot balms. And before a long trek specifically, I will use some type of um, balm like Hydropel or a wax or even Vaseline, so that I can condition my feet to be hydrophobic. And it really does work, and it works very effectively. So that when you get on the trail, the the exposure to sweat and mud and moisture from river crossings and things like this don't have quite such a huge impact on softening the dermal layers of the feet. And to me, that's been a total game changer for how I look at preparing my feet for a backpacking trip.
Yeah, I'll second that. I recently started using this system, and also on a recent through hike of the Tahoe Rim Trail, I did a Joshua Tree climbing balm on my feet every morning to condition them for that, and that worked really well. Ultimately, I think because it was a early summer hike that I had a lot of snowpack still to deal with, so my feet were wet every day, all day long for 7 days, and it just they couldn't keep up. But it was a good system for the first few days, especially.
Good, yeah. And again, this is one of those things, you can't change the nature of your epidermis overnight. It takes literally months of recurring use to really change the extent to which your feet can resist water absorption.
In a recent blog post, you said that one of the best things that you could do to prepare for backpacking is to maintain as closely as possible your ideal body weight. So, just a couple of really practical questions. How can someone find out what their ideal body weight is, and what are some strategies that you found successful to maintain that?
There is so much controversy around this topic. I kind of want to run away from it, but I'll I'll give you my 2 cents. And um, the the cheap answer is, it depends on you. It depends on how strong your bones are, how big your bones are, how much cartilage are in between your bones at the joints, what your ligament strength is and your tendon strength and your muscle strength, the extent of historical injuries, all these kinds of things. Now, if you have fairly if you have good high density bones and they're good sized and the rest of your soft tissues are in great shape, you can carry more body weight without adverse effects. And likewise, if you're older or aging, or you have decreasing bone density or less cartilage in your bones, or maybe you've had some muscle and tendon injuries in your back or lower body, then you're going to have to consider that a leaner body mass is going to be better as you become more injured or as you age. So nobody tells you this, and there's no easy way to measure this. And so really it comes down to you paying attention to what you're capable of, what feels good, and what weight you've been at when you've had historical injuries and things like this. And it's really difficult to figure out. You can start with body mass index tables. I don't think that's too wise. I would rather see you have a good accurate body fat measurement, going to your local gym or hospital sometimes have this, and doing a pool immersion body fat measurement, or a DEXA scan, or a bioelectric impedance measurement using a scale that has both the hand grips and the feet sensors, because those are far more accurate than the consumer scales. And so determining your body fat and then kind of targeting that towards what other athletes are experiencing at their body fat, that's a decent starting point. But just remember, it's not necessarily exactly appropriate for you. So I would start with an accurate body fat measurement, take a look at some body fat tables, and find out what body fat percentages do marathon runners have if marathoning is your gig? What body fat percentage do professional mountain bikers have? And maybe that's one of your targets if mountain biking is your gig. There's not a lot of data about this for long distance hiking, but ultra marathon running would be a good estimate there, because they're typically running at an aerobic pace and doing it fairly slow over a long period of time. So it's a reasonable mimic for backpacking.
So let's finish up by talking about a sample training plan. Have you created for yourself just kind of a general blueprint that you tailor slightly depending on each trip you're going on, or do you kind of start from scratch each time and really re examine your circumstances?
We'll go back to 2015. My highlight trip of the year was a 12-day traverse of the Wind River Range, but it was a glacier traverse. It included a climb of Gannett Peak and another mountaineering objective. So, and it was carrying a heavy pack, 50 pounds or so. And so I trained for that scenario specifically. Most of the time, I'm training for a scenario of similar length, massive amounts of elevation gain at high altitude in mountainous environments, mostly off trail. So that's kind of my model objective. And my strategy is really to go through an annual training cycle and try to time my peak for whatever my most important trip of the year is going to be. So, for example, if my peak trip is going to be in September or October, I will likely start training for that in November or December. And then as soon as my trekking season kind of falls off, then I can pull back from that and rest for a month or two and let my body recover from all this load and the last expedition, and start a new cycle all over again. So that's kind of what I do. Is it's an annual cycle, but I always try to peak around the time of my most difficult trip.
Let's say somebody has an hour a day for 3 or 4 or 5 days a week. What is the best combination of things that they can do to progress towards a backpacking goal?
I'm going to assume that this is a completely untrained person or someone who does not intentionally do fitness training. So let's say they have 6 hours a week total. I think I would recommend spending 4 of those hours a week doing aerobic activities and 2 hours a week doing core and lower body strength training. That's probably like bare minimum if you want to intentionally train for an expedition that is a few months out in advance. And I would take those 4 hours of aerobic and split them into 2 1-hour sessions of high intensity aerobic close to your aerobic threshold, and then 1 2-hour session that ideally would be a good fast hard hike in the mountains.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap it up. Just keep in mind, this is intentionally a short podcast. If we get interest in this and you want to hear some more, we can go more deeply into a lot of these concepts and really dig in. So please let us know at podcast@backpackinglight.com. Shoot us an email, find us on Twitter, Facebook, and shoot us a message. Let you know if you want to hear some more about training. Well, Ryan, thanks for your time. That's gonna do it for this episode of the BPL podcast.
Sounds good, Andrew. Great chatting again with you today.
So you can download the show notes for this episode by visiting backpackinglight.com/podcast. This podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Leave us a review. It helps other people find the show. Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. And if we can leave you with one parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.